So this will be the first of a two-part video with regards to the question, what should I practice? Whilst the VRL is a self-directed platform in which the practitioner should ideally be choosing the projects and the project pathways which are most applicable to them and their personal objectives, of course, there is going to be the question of, okay, what is perhaps more valuable from this particular perspective of movement or movement practice. So this first part will propose some ideas with regards to movement development and what you see in front of you here, which is a movement development pyramid. And the hope is that having some of these ideas and plugging them into your own objectives, you can consider what might be most appropriate with regards to specific contexts of practice, and of course in the same breath, what is perhaps not worth your time practicing. So first of all, this movement development period is something entirely conceptual. It's not fixed, and it's not final, and there's many ways that we could change it, but this is what we're going with for the purposes of considering what's of value for you to practice. So as you can see here, the base layer are fundamental movement patterns. Fundamental movement patterns, which we'll get into a little bit more specifically in just a moment. These are everyday movements in some cases, or for example, forms and things like this, which are really, really fundamental to human movement. So we could even call them human movement patterns. Above this, we also have transferable capacities, qualities, and characteristics, each individual but interconnected aspects that we'll get to again in a moment. And these are most of the things that are practiced and developed through the resources and contexts that are proposed in the video resource library, and I would propose are the main things worth focusing on for developmental movement practice, as well as, of course, these fundamental movement patterns as well. And as we see conveniently as a pyramid is, these form the predominant base of this movement development pyramid, which means there's a lot of potential development in there. And also important to remember is that when we develop something on the lower end of the period, the pyramid, it has direct effect that can be positive and negative to what is above it next on the pyramid. But the inverse is not true. Not wholly true. So in some cases, I can develop certain capacities, but it might not improve. And in some cases, it might actually be detrimental to certain fundamental movement patterns. But of course, there is some play in here as well. At the top of the pyramid, what we see there are skills, techniques, and more specific patterns and capacities. So in many cases, developing this particular area of the movement development pyramid will not have a strong transferable effect further down the pyramid, and again, can actually have even more exacerbated negative effects if they're invested in very, very heavily without consideration of those more base layers. So in this area, we get to places such as just very specific disciplines or very specific movement contexts. This is never to say, of course, that something's positive or negative, because the question is, what should I practice? That being you, the practitioner, and it depends, of course, upon your personal inclinations, orientations, objectives, and goals. Let's take a look first at the most base layer, which is the fundamental movement patterns. We call it the base layer. So some things we want to consider with regards to selecting movement context and what you should practice and what you should open as projects of practice that will, in some cases, continue over the many, many months and even years in development in different forms, whether that's capacity development, such as a range or like strength, or whether it's developing certain patterns that take a lot of time. We consider first and foremost, for example, certain positions in space. So having a fundamental understanding of the differences between being in a certain gait, being in a standing position, transitioning then lower into this world which we call low gait. And this is very much bipedal, but we can also extrapolate this to quadrupedal as well, but that's something different. But just shifting slightly low there, having experience and having an understanding of where this place is and how movement potential exists there. Then we have the squat level, moving down, of course, to essentially the lowest bipedal level we can go without entering into the floor. And then, of course, entering the floor for floor entry, floor exit. And, with regards to fundamental human capacities and potential, and movement patterns, this can be comprising getting up and getting back down again. So something very, very fundamental with regards to an understanding and the capacity to change position in space. Structural forms. This is when we start putting a little bit more of a name tag on certain structures that the body can take, certain structures that it can place itself into, which, as we move forward, can develop into specific, say, strength forms, mobility forms, and then eventually towards certain movement patterns as well, developmental movement patterns. So a form such as a squatting form, and an understanding of how certain squatting forms are more conducive to different things, and whether that's, for example, lifting a load or moving through space, or simply, again, getting up and getting down. Lunging as well, so this kind of split leg form, not necessarily, of course, just a lunge in a very strict exercise context, but in any case, you might split the legs to reach, for example, in a tennis serve or something like this, or changing direction, we would have a form of a lunge. And then, of course, we have hinging patterns, a very strong form which allows us to use a lot of the strength of the posterior chain, but likewise then it helps us explore if there's any restrictions in there as well, this particular hinging form. And we have abducting, and this can be with the arms of the leg or the legs, just the range as an example of being able to abduct the arms or abduct the legs. This also comes into, abducted reaching for something, as a climber would, as an example, for a holder with the leg and the foot. And of course, structural forms such as forward folding, and we have side and back bending as well. So these structural forms, again, are very, very fundamental movement patterns for the human form. And it doesn't necessarily mean that we need to be, back bending and doing bridges and things like this. But we do want to invest in the potential of, for example, just looking behind me. In some cases, we might find that individuals don't even have this experience for many, many, many years. And the same with things like forward folding and reaching towards the floor, something very fundamental, as well as overhead reaching. And this comes into the world of hanging, of course. And another thing we can consider are things such as twisting and rotating, namely of the trunk. And this connects with further ideas such as force generation and things like this. We then, of course, have locomotion patterns. Of course, human potential is also to move through space. So we can run, of course, we can walk, we can sprint, and we can skip. These are very fundamental bipedal patterns for moving through space. But as an example, in many cases, we don't run or sprint or skip. So these are things that we can develop as fundamental human patterns. Crawling as well, in closer proximity to the floor. We can propose things such as semi and quadrupedal type of crawling, as we do in the resource library as well. But also we have floor contact crawling, as a baby would in the phases of learning to walk upright. and creeping as well. Creeping is this idea of moving in this low gate position, and again, largely bipedal when we consider this idea, and this comes into the idea of weight shifting and having this awareness of shifting weight from one leg to another. So in the video resource library, for example, in context, we see this such as the boo-boo form, the horse stance form, taking these movements through space. And then, of course, we have rolling patterns we can locomote with. We see these also, as well as other transitions of getting in and out of the floor in the floor work contexts of the video resource library. Sliding also in space, we can turn and we can pivot, which is slightly different. A turn I can execute just on the spot, and a pivot can help me move as you would, for example, in basketball on a fixed point, such as a foot, but this can also be a hand, and allowing us to adjust position and orientation in space. And we can, of course, scale and traverse as well. So this includes the world of climbing, and negotiating over objects, above, below, and across objects, and things in space that can even block us, for example, walls and things like this. We can then consider, with regards to fundamental human patterns, trajectories of movement. So this is an understanding of movement in and through space. So as an example, I can spin around, but I can also notice that when I'm spinning, this starts to take me through space. There's a certain physics about it that will affect movement through space, how we move through space, as well as just in space, which can be fixed in this particular position. So things such as the ubiquitous eights, I like to call them, these kind of infinity figure eights. We can move the body in a type of figure eight through space, as well as in space, just moving my arm or my hand, working with particular figure eights. We see this in patterns such as the teacups and many other things, even in connection with objects. Circles, and with circles, of course, we have curves and we have the arcs as well. So something such as the hole, an understanding of moving in an arc. A pivot is a type of an arc, for example. The spiral, we have this kind of 2D spiral as a general concept. And again, this can be the world of, for example, the turn. And then the helix, which comes into more 3D, which if I were to continually work through this figure eight, I can draw that helix through space. And in many cases, all of these really belong to the spiral, the helix and the arc and the circle, the half circle. They all kind of belong to this spiral dimension. Lastly, we also have this idea of waves. So whether that can be waves in the body, kind of undulations, whether it's kind of global waves or kind of localized waves or specific places. And we can wave through space, and we have to always remember that movement and energy, essentially energy always moves in waves. There's no type of energy that does not have a wave aspect about it. And for movement to happen, there must be energy of some form. This also ties in with an understanding of a recycling of energy. So being able to recycle these movement trajectories, and in some cases being able to use them to magnify the force which comes out of it. So as an example, if I'm doing a hole, which is in the area of groundwork, and I express a cortocapim, which is the swinging of the leg around, I can use this energy from the hole to take me directly into the spin of the leg, and that spin of the leg can then create more momentum and pull me out of it and lead into something else as well, following that same movement trajectory. And this is something that really does need to be cultivated through movement. In some cases, we kind of go against the grain if we're not familiar, or if we cannot sense the movement trajectory that's happening. So as an example, maybe I'm moving and turning to the left, and then I integrate a movement, but for some reason I kind of get a bit confused, I hesitate, I stop, and then I start moving in the other direction. And unless that was deliberately intended, what would normally make more sense is if we go with the movement. This comes closely to ideas, for example, of reading movement, which we get to in a moment. And reading movement, if there is a kick coming to my face, to my left side here, I should have the understanding and be able to read the movement and an understanding of the movement trajectory that's happening, that I don't walk into that and take also the left direction. I would go against it, or effectively with the movement, to avoid being struck by it. And lastly, we've just proposed this idea of movement mechanics. So with developing this base layer of fundamental movement patterns, in the video resource library, we use contexts such as, let's say, a bent and straight arm concept, working with a bent arm or a straight arm, working with the scapula to push or to pull, working vertically, horizontally, laterally, and proposing specific mechanics that are the most conducive for these particular scenarios, in most cases based in quite fundamental, physics and human biomechanics. So some of these ideas, as well as producing force, it's also this idea to be able to withstand force or absorb force. So push up as an example, I might be, pushing my body through space, displacing myself through space. But when I do something like a straight arm planche hold, I'm withstanding a particular force, so I'm staying isometric in space. And as well, with producing force, I might jump, but then to absorb force, I might land. To produce force, I might throw. To absorb force, I might catch. So these, again, are very, very fundamental movement patterns, movement concepts as well, but they are expressed really on the physical layer, and we can be proficient in them or less proficient in them. And this is why it's proposed that these are the most basic layers in terms of the actual base layer of establishing movement development and building on that, and taking it to new places, and increasing eventually capacities, qualities, and characteristics related to them, which we can get to in just a moment. Just one thing lastly to consider with movement mechanics is, again, this idea of force generation and transmission, which we also see in movement trajectories. Again, this idea of recycling energy, generating energy, and transmitting it. And for example, if I were to swing a sword, I swing a sword, but if I were to suddenly halt and stop, I would get quite a shock to my system. And if I continue this pattern over time, it can result in a type of overuse injury, or a compensation injury, or at least some kind of structural imbalance that might not serve me well in other contexts, such as just basic human functional movement. So if I was swinging a sword, I might then use an arc or a curve to recycle that energy, but then I can bring that back in again. So I might throw this way, and then arc, pull back, and then pull back the other way. And of course, I'm using the idea of a sword, but we can see this in swinging a bat, or tennis play, and something like this, the forehand and the backhand. So they're very, very interconnected, and they form the base level of the pyramid. So this means that when you're asking yourself the question, what should I practice? Ask yourself the question, first of all, do I have physical, embodied, and practice experience in some of these particular areas? Is there anything that's really missing? For example, if you have always been in a type of physical practice in which you stay fixed in one space. So let's say, for example, like a yoga discipline, it's quite clear that you're missing some experience with something really, really fundamental, which is human locomotion patterns. And if I only have an athletics practice, as an example, which has particular forms and positions, such as I play, football or soccer, this position in space doesn't really use the squat level. It doesn't really use any floor entry or exit. So, of course, this is something that's significantly missing. And if even I am a calisthenics practitioner and I have very, very strong physical capacities in terms of strength and other things as well, Because this is very, very, linear movements, pulling, pushing, in this type of way. Am I missing experience with human trajectories of movements, such as circles, such as arcs, spirals, helixes, waves? Are these really, really fundamental things missing from my practice? And then, of course, there are projects and individual movement contexts in the video resource library, which precisely contribute towards the development of these particular qualities. So sometimes that can be a specific project, such as working with patterns with the arms, or emptying protocols and things like this. Or it can be as part of the context, but just as it comes kind of free with it, such as practice of groundwork, as an example, includes a lot of rotational forms. There's a lot of twisting inside it. So these arcs and these spirals and these circles are implicit in that practice as well. So this is something to take into consideration when reflecting again and thinking, where should I place my effort? We can move then on to the next layer of the pyramid, which is the transferable capacities, qualities, and characteristics, and we'll take them one by one. But I will just mention again that the video resource library and what is presented there are very much, in terms of the developmental aspect of it, very much oriented around this particular area. And that's not so much a decision of these are the most important, so let's make the most resources and the most projects and focus on this area. It's actually more the other way around. All of this is reverse reflection and reverse engineering, and it just so happens that most of the contexts, the majority of what's presented, what is shared, what is considered essentially of value for movement development and practice from a movement perspective, just falls into this particular category, and this just seems to be the widest one. Although I've said that there is not so much transferability from the further up the pyramid to further down, there is a lot of transferability still between these two. So let's say, for an example, I'm missing some fundamental range in my squat level, or I can't enter into the floor because I have, a sore elbow, or just something is not functioning optimally on my physical layer. Then developing capacities in those particular places, such as flexibility or mobility, or where it's needed, things like strength, these things can have a direct transferable effect to those other layers, both up and down. So it can affect, of course, my ability to perform particular skills, techniques, and patterns. And in some cases, it can do the opposite. But it can also likewise help improve my fundamental movement patterns. And in many cases, it is completely necessary to bring ourselves to harder focus in this particular area, transferable capacities, qualities, and characteristics, in order to develop those baseline movement patterns, what we've determined as the fundamental movement patterns. We're mostly familiar with hard capacities. Hard capacities are, as I mentioned, things like flexibility and mobility, and we can consider that, for example, on the small frame, whether that's fingers, toes, the spine, even the scapular complex, or the large frame, and we start looking at the global form. How far can I stretch? Can I form a sustainable global arching form, and bending in different directions and things such as this? Also, of course, strength. There are many qualities of strength that we can consider, but speed and power, of course, which is the combination of strength and speed. Also, this idea of neuromuscular efficiency. How much of my motor neurons and my muscle fibers can I elicit for use at any one particular time? And this is something which can be trained to be to a particular efficiency. So as an example, I might have a lot of muscle fibers, maybe I'm very hypertrophied, but my potential to actually activate those muscle fibers, as many as possible at the same time, and then actually have a particular strength or power output might be a big discrepancy. So that's why you can get like, a really small guy that's super, super strong, and then like a really, really big guy, and yet perhaps able to move or withstand the same particular load. And so another kind of informal term for that is neural drive. And, can you use the muscles that you actually have? We also consider the idea of endurance. So how much can those muscles do on this kind of physical layer, which comes also towards things like energy systems training, how efficiently you can use oxygen, and things like this, and conditioning as well, which can have a couple of meanings. Conditioning generally refer to cardiovascular efficiency and heart rate. And I would also personally use it, conditioning, in terms of being accustomed to something, which is quite different, but I think quite important. So I can perform, for example, a particular movement, such as, let's say, a bridge rotation, or something that is not, maximal strength context, or I can perform like this very basic bear crawl. But how well can I keep up that quality, and how accustomed am I to being in that position? Can I do, for example, 10 repetitions of a bridge rotation each side, but it absolutely kills me and the quality just goes to shit? Or can I, do that and it's absolutely fine and I have no issues with it? And likewise, I can crawl quite proficiently on my hands and feet, and it doesn't take too much from my energy, and also from my joints and things like this, or does it absolutely kill me? And that essentially would mean how accustomed or conditioned am I to performing in that particular context. And then we have structural integrity as something which is a capacity. And we would think of this in terms of practice, such as prehabilitation. And again, this is like small, large frame. How stable are my joints? How resilient are they? Can they adapt when I place a particular stress on them? Do they have the potential to sustain my structure when I enter and exit particular forms, or engage in particular movement contexts, and place particular loads on them at particular angles and specific ranges, etc., etc.? So one thing that we want to keep in mind with this center place of the pyramid, the transferable capacities, because we do speak about capacities as well in the higher end of the pyramid, in the peak there, is that these are transferable. And this is a very, very, very important movement concept, which is essentially that is what I'm practicing, whether that's a pattern, or what am I developing, such as a capacity, strength and mobility, how transferable, how applicable is it to other areas of physical practice, general movement, specific disciplines even, or my everyday life. So there might be a cut-off point, or more specifically, I would say for everyone there is a cut-off point. It's not, cut and dry like this, but there is a point where I can ask myself the question, okay, is this sufficient for what I might need this for in 90% of the scenarios? So I would say that there is an amount of strength and there is an amount of mobility that you can develop, that you can go to any movement discipline and either be well ahead of the game in terms of those capacities, applying them with particular movement patterns is something completely different. But that kind of physical capacity, you'd be well ahead, or need very, very little to maybe adjust and tweak and kind of catch up a little bit. So as an example, you can build a physical capacity that you can take to the climbing wall or to parkour, or to certain martial arts, and find that you don't need any more general strength training or flexibility or mobility to progress in this practice. All you need to do is perhaps some more specific capacities, grip strength, certain joint integrity, more so in particular places, but you're not going to benefit from just increasing those capacities even more. They start to become very, very specific. So holding oneself off of the floor and being able to sustain oneself in a tuck planche form might be very, very transferable to something such as parkour. When I move through space and I have to support myself, whether that's overcoming a particular obstacle or negotiating somewhere in space like a rail, but being able to perform a straddle planche or a full planche is perhaps not necessary. And the same, if we use the same idea as climbing, it can be very, very valuable to have experience with this idea of front levering. So being able to hold a front lever in the context of a straight arm front lever, being able to lift my hips in space has direct application to things like climbing in an overhang. If you're bouldering or maybe outdoor climbing and overhang, being able to reach with the feet. Of course, it wouldn't be so strict. You wouldn't be performing particular straight arm. You do whatever you need to get the job done. But there is direct application in terms of experience in that area. And the same, of course, goes for basic ranges of leg abduction. If I can perform, a reasonable splits, front splits and middle splits, it's very unlikely I'm going to find myself the need to have a full front split and full middle split. But I can certainly reach further with the leg if I'm climbing to a place where I might not be able to if I didn't have that. And likewise, I might be able to kick a little bit higher or with a little bit control and a little bit safer for the joints in certain martial arts practices if I have that particular range. So those capacities, this is what we mean by transferable, and this should affect the decision again of what should I practice. In the video resource library, there are progressive pathways given to work towards quite specialized things, such as straddle planches, front lever, back lever, and things like this, and even handstand work. And this is then the decision of the practitioner. Do I choose to take that? When I do, I know that it is perhaps slightly beyond what's considered a transferable capacity and going in quite a specific area, but at least I do that with the knowledge and keeping a balance with my wider practice. One of the next things we look at are softer things. So we speak about hard capacities, but we also have soft qualities. So again, these are not exclusive at all. There's many other things we can consider, but one of the main ones that I always think of myself is a quality of structural awareness, and again, large and small frame. Am I aware of how I fit, for example, my particular structure, my individual structure, which is not going to change the dimensions of my structure? How do I fit into a particular movement context? So even something such as, a 5-step horse stance, if we were to measure the distance between feet and go, yeah, that's the distance of a 5-step horse stance, it's just not going to work because people have different leg dimensions, hip dimensions, and feet dimensions, and things like this. And the same goes for a bridging form. And this is also going to be subject to certain capacities. If I'm forming a particular bridge form, I may need to have my feet and arms or hands further or closer apart depending upon the dimensions of my structure. And the dimensions of my structure in this case, because it's in the large frame mobility form, is also going to be subject to those particular mobility capacities. So this then changes over time. So I need to continually refine my structural awareness to know, if I want to reach over this position, if I want to shift my foot in this particular direction, such as in a Cossack squat, I want to shift my weight into the left, but then still have the foot fully planted so I can produce optimal force. But then I want to be fully extended on the other side so I'm at maximal reach. I need to have the structural awareness of, what are my dimensions? Where do I place the feet so that I can fulfill this particular form and the intentions of it? So structural awareness, of course, on the small frame can be the ability, for example, to work with particular rolling patterns and knowing where the position of the spine is in space, being able to anterior and posterior pelvic tilt, which again can come back to, ties in with fundamental, movement patterns, also having a particular capacity in terms of neuromuscular efficiency and neural drive to control those muscles. And then when we take it into application in terms of practice, handstand alignment is a perfect example. Being able to have the structural awareness to know where is the position of my pelvis right now, where is the position of my spine, knowing, for example, my elbows, are my elbows straight, am I lifting, am I elevating the shoulders when I need to, etc., etc. Staying on this subject of hand balancing, because it's a nice one to use when we think about qualities, is proprioceptive, spatial, and kinesthetic awareness. So proprioceptive awareness, we can develop these types of qualities through practice in handstand by movement of the legs, knowing where my legs are in space whilst I'm upside down. And this, of course, becomes something entirely new because I might know, okay, yeah, I lift my leg is here. But when you're upside down, things kind of turn upside down, quite literally. But it can also be when I'm doing a bridge rotation, or I'm just doing, for example, a back bend, I can really lose orientation. So another quality that we have there, which isn't written down, is vestibular development. So being able to orient myself in space, and of course that sensual feedback of regaining a fixed spot and balance. So if I'm doing a reach back to the wall, do I know where my hands are? As an example, it seems like something simple, but sometimes we can just lose where the hands are in space. So spatial awareness as well. If I'm working with a wall, what distance do I need from a wall so I do or I don't contact it? Can you perform a handstand practice in 2 by 2 meters and know that when you fall, you have to, retract your foot just that, dorsiflect just that few inches so that you don't hit the wall or the person next to you. Spatial awareness in terms of jumping and grabbing hold of a bar, depth perception. Sometimes you might have the feeling if you go to do a pull-up or to hang, the bar is slightly above you and you go to jump, and even though you know it's kind of this far, you're not sure, how much power you need to generate to catch it, and you hesitate and it's only this far, but you miss it. This is spatial awareness, and of course this ties in with another thing I mentioned as well, we haven't written here, which is power generation, power management. How much force do I need, for example, to kick up into a handstand? Kinesthetic awareness as well. Do I have, again, that sensation of moving through space, of movement trajectories? Am I turning left, turning right? And an understanding of how to make what has been referred to in the resource library as movement sense. Does it make sense the way that I'm moving in and through space? We also